Good morning, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. As always, I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and we're always pleased to welcome back Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert, to the show. So it's been, I think, about almost a month since we've done an episode of this, and it's not to say that nothing has been happening in the interim, but there have been, the last thing we talked about was the liberation of Kherson, which was fairly large, significant event. And the time has also gone into when we're getting into the winter months when things are getting colder, and the forces on both sides are probably starting to posture themselves for cold weather operations. But again, not that nothing has happened. Something that we have seen over the last month, which gets directly into headlines from today, as a matter of fact, has been not so much movement of ground forces on the battlefield as continued waves of long-range missile strikes against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and populations. And as I said, right up to today, this morning, there was the latest salvo of largely cruise-type missiles, but also some guided missiles launched from aircraft from Russian strategic bombers. And again, targets are, civilian infrastructure, especially electricity generating things, which we had a talk here yesterday with a former ambassador to Ukraine, as well as General Fulford out in UCOM, and the point seemed pretty clear that we had talked previously, like trying to figure out why they're targeting these types of things with a dwindling number of long range precision munitions. Our guests yesterday were pretty clear that the intent is now to make the Ukrainians freeze, is to shut off their power, make it cold, make it miserable, cause whatever death or dislocation that freezing temperatures and not having any heat or electricity is going to do, to put intense pressure on the Ukrainian population to, look for an end to the war on favorable Russian terms. So, Yuval, if you want to take it and kind of go get us up to what happened today and some of the implications.
No, so certainly, and so part of the discussion that we heard yesterday from Ambassador William Taylor, who's previously ambassador to Ukraine, and since leaving government has really staked out perhaps one of the most strident defenses of Ukraine and advocating for greater military as well as diplomatic and economic support to Ukraine. And in the discussion that was had, he outlined that effectively what the Russians are not able to do is win on the battlefield. And so what they're trying to do, as you mentioned, is to just make the Ukrainian population as uncomfortable and effectively as sick as possible, with the idea on the Russian side of basically creating popular discontent with the Zelensky government so that the Zelensky government comes to the negotiating table, one, at all, and two, from a position of relative weakness before the Ukrainian army, which is continuing to advance, even though it's at a much slower pace than before, before the Ukrainians can win, in effect. The reality on the ground, talking to people who are in Ukraine right now and, just observing both Ukrainian as well as Western news reporting, and then also looking at Russian news reporting, is like in many times before, air attacks without the credible threat of basically ground invasion just makes people more angry at people firing the missiles. We saw this in, the London Blitz in World War II, and even before, like when the British were trying to basically rule Iraq from the air in the early 1920s, is that air attacks basically are useful as part of something, but by themselves, they don't really shape what the population is going to do. So what we have now is just a further angering of the Ukrainian population against Russia and Russians, maybe not now for 2 generations, but maybe for 3 generations, because this aerial bombing campaign is going to be part of the narrative of the formation of modern Ukraine that we've been seeing. So part of that is, as Russia has moved towards the civilian destruction of civilian infrastructure, the responses from the West have been basically twofold. One is, at this point, we are in the above 100 million dollars, euros combined from Western Europe as well as the United States, in just emergency provision of generators, so that basically people can have this relatively low tech solution to the electricity problems. But we've also seen in basically recent days is that the air defense systems being provided to Ukraine have really increased to the level where just this week, Patriot missiles, a Patriot air defense system, is going to be given to Ukraine. And I thought this would be a good moment. This is a really big deal, but not 100% of our viewers are experts in air defense systems. Many, I think, of our viewers or listeners have a passing familiarity, and some are not clear what this is altogether. So I think this would be a good moment to understand. Missiles are coming from Russia. What air defense doing? So, Ian, I would like to ask you, what exactly is air defense? What is integrated air defense? And what is basically special or exquisite or exceptional about Patriot missiles that basically will help make a difference to Ukraine's ability to defend itself?
Yeah, and I'm glad we talked about this yesterday, so I had time to do a little bit of homework to to refresh myself, because as an aviator, we're taught about concepts of integrated air defense, but in practicality, it's not something that at least on the deployments I've been on, was ever an issue. When you're fighting insurgents, I will say that when some of our operations in support of Operation Inherent Resolve and getting close to Syria, those pilots probably faced the challenge of integrated air defense systems operated by the Syrians. But outside of that, it's been a long time since American pilots have had to face it. But it doesn't mean that they don't exist, and they've always been briefed to us as one of the most deadly things that are available to a defender to interdict aircraft and missiles. So I'll kind of go from like the big to the small here first. So what is an integrated air defense system, and what does it mean when we talk about that's what Ukraine is using to protect its cities against these missile attacks? So as I was already giving a comparison to you before we started recording. There's a difference between point air defense and area air defense. And the point air defense is sort of what we saw in the early weeks of the war, right? Which is a person with a Stinger missile, launched up against a singular target, and it's sort of one missile, one target, and you got to be fairly close to that target to acquire it within the sensor window of the weapon, which is fairly short range. An integrated air defense system is something that can protect against incoming missiles or aircraft over a much wider area, and that's because it's a lot more than just like one person on the ground with one missile. Which they need some sort of visual cueing often for a lot of these missiles. You got to be able to see it, right, to get to point your missile at it, and then the optics will pick up the thermal signature, but somebody's still got to see it, and you have to be relatively close because those weapons don't go very far. Integrated air defense is a collection of ground-based, not just weapons, but the interceptors, the missiles themselves are sort of the last piece of it, but also other sensors, radar, command and control structure, information, networked information sharing capabilities, so that the different, sensors can track what's coming in. And then you have to make some decisions about, what missiles are the highest threat and what are not. And so there's a lot of computers, a lot of sensors, and a lot of different human decision makers inside of this. And, the quick homework I did, and I'll actually give a shout out to the Mitchell Aerospace Institute, which Dan Rice, our China SME, works at. They have a little briefer here on it that I'm just going to give some highlights from. But, integrated air defense, it's got sort of three big components. There's air surveillance, battle management, and weapons control. So that air surveillance is sort of your first step. Like it's those sensors and that network of sharing sensor information that's looking up at the sky to detect, identify, share that information across the systems to make a determination about where missiles are coming in from, which ones are dangerous, and then starting to pass that information on to the sort of the battle management piece, which is when you start making those decisions about evaluating the threat, right? Is it an incoming missile? Is it a danger? How do we figure that out? We have to look at the trajectory and determine where it might be going. How fast is it going? What are the opportunities to intercept it? And then sort of once you determine what type of weapon it is, or what kind of incoming weapon it is, whether it's a threat, you have to make a We call it a weapon to target match. Like, is it depending on the velocity of the system? Is it something that can be interdicted with perhaps, ground based air defense artillery, like flak guns, basically modern flak guns, like the German, I'm going to butcher the name, but the German, it's a flak wagon of some kind. I've seen the Gerhard, maybe. I might have to go and back this up later on with some more research, but it's a German ground-based air defense system we've seen, but it's mini cannons. So it's shooting, a screen of bullets up in the sky, using its sensors to cue it so those bullets like meet the missile at the right point in three-dimensional space, blow it up. Or is it a missile that's maybe at a higher velocity or higher altitude that air defense artillery can't get at? And that's when you start looking at those ground-based missile interceptors. Some of the former Russian systems Ukrainians have been using, like the S-300, S-400 surface-to-air missile. And then this gets into the Patriot systems, which is what they've been asking for a lot, and which we're now going to give them. But then once you sort of made that weapon determination, then the final point is given authority to launch and try and intercept an incoming missile. So that's integrated air defense. It's a lot of different pieces that all have to work together effectively in order to make an interception happen. And it's been interesting to watch. Well, not interesting, maybe not the right word, but in observing how the Ukrainians have sort of been posturing air defense around their cities in the course of these waves of missile attacks. It seems to be a combination of just getting better at it, whether it's better training or better emplacement of their weapons and sensors and C2 architecture, as well as getting better air defense systems themselves, like the German flak cannon I was talking about. They have steadily increased their rate of missile interceptions. So I think this morning there was something upwards of 70 missiles that were fired at a variety of targets, and reporting is that 60 of those were successfully intercepted and destroyed, before they got to their targets. Which isn't to say that like a missile destroyed in air just like magically poof goes away. It's going to fall and can still cause damage on the ground. It's not hitting whatever critical target it was fired at to intended to destroy. So that's a pretty good interception rate, and I think it's definitely trended upward from what we were seeing when these missile volleys against civilian targets first started. But obviously more is better for them, because as we've been talking about, like their infrastructure has been pounded and pounded and pounded. 60 out of 70 is great, but if those 10 get through to your last power generating station for a region, the 60 interceptions don't kind of matter, because one still got through and got to the target. So that's why they've been asking for, increasingly more capable and as well as longer range systems to reach out. And like the farther you can reach out and push that air defense bubble, the more opportunity you have to hit that missile before it gets to a target. And being able to push that bubble out means you could attempt multiple interceptions now at longer ranges, so that you increase your odds. Like, okay, first interception, it missed. Now I still have a chance, though. I've got some distance over the ground that the incoming missile still has to travel for additional interception opportunities. And that gets into that sort of that weapon to target match and decision making, because I think part of the Russian approach here, it's an approach that if you're talking about, say drone swarms or other kind of missile swarms, if you saturate a target with a bunch of weapons, you're making it harder for the air defense on the ground to do their job. Right. They might have to make some tough decisions about what weapons are you being used to intercept where, and you might be accepting the hard truth that you're not going to be able to get everything. You push the defense bubble farther out there, you increase your option, your ability to have multiple decision points where say there's 2 coming in out of 60 kilometers, you get one of them, you've got another air defense system that's interdicting from another direction. It did it successfully. Now you can shift that weapon over to go after that second missile that got through, and just increasing your odds of interception. So the whole point is having a layered defense pushed out as far as possible to give you multiple chances to get after the incoming weapons. And so what the Patriots will bring to the table, one, it's a maybe venerable is not the right word, because it's been regularly upgraded. But, I was showing you, I did bring a little historical artifact with me to sort of highlight, at least like for me personally, how long this weapon system has been around. So this is actually a trading card from the Topps company from Desert Storm. And this is sort of my first, I was much younger then, my first conscious memory of air defense. I was like 10, 11 years old. If you'd asked me what air defense was back then, I couldn't have told you. But if you'd asked me what a Patriot missile was, I could have definitely told you, because I had the card, but I also had very strong memories of the headlines in newspapers or watching CNN of Patriot missiles intercepting Scud missiles that Saddam Hussein was firing toward Israel. And so, this is going back to the very early 1990s. The system has been continually upgraded since then. It's one of sort of the NATO standard air defense systems. It's proliferated across NATO countries in Europe, and it's also been sold to a lot of American allies around the world. And so what it gets you is that longer range bubble, basically, right? I don't know what the exact specs on it are, but it can about between 60 and 70 kilometers. That's the range of the missile. And at that point, your only limitation is the queuing, is like the battle management and surveillance part of that is being able to detect an incoming missile so the Patriot can engage it at its maximum range. And so what else the Patriot does is that it's modular and it's very mobile. So that's probably good for Ukraine, wanting to be able to pick up and move their systems so that they're not in static positions and they can't be targeted by Russian attempts to degrade their air defense system when they get it. It can be sort of set up and broken down relatively rapidly. All of the components of it are on, trucks or trailers. So as long as there's a road nearby, you can pick it up and move it. So among the reasons why it had been articulated early in the war, why we didn't give it to them, was that it's very manpower intensive. I think it's, again, I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's like upwards of 80 or 90 personnel it takes to operate a Patriot battery. And that's a lot. And you have to be trained on it. It's not something you can just fall in on. And so among the reasons we're given for not giving him right away was that it was too manpower intensive. We're not going to put NATO troops in Ukraine to operate it. So, who's going to run it? Even if you gave it to them on day one, it would take them, they'd have to get trained on how to use it, and they wouldn't be able to use it immediately. The rationale behind those arguments is kind of moot now, because now we're giving it to them. So I don't know whether they've been getting trained sort of in the background, and now that they're trained, we're going to give them the systems, or if this month-long wave after wave of missile attacks was sort of finally the thing that broke through and was like, yeah, they need, for military as well as humanitarian reasons, they need better air defense around their cities. So now it's time to give them sort of top of the line system that's out there.
That's excellent. So when we think about the spectrum of air defense, the point system, a guy with a Stinger who's able to take down a missile or helicopter or plane by himself, very thrilling when you see that video on YouTube. But that's also hard to do.
Yeah, and actually, as you bring that up, there's another example that I could have thought of to give it like the spectrum of the layer, right? I think during one of the Iranian drone attacks with the Shahad drones on Kyiv itself, there was a story about like a police officer firing, their service rifle up in the air to try and knock it down before it got to a target. And I'm not saying that to be humorous, but the point is, like, that's air defense too. Like, air defense is everything from like the last ditch shooting your personal weapon up in the air to try and knock something down, just using eyeballs and Kentucky windage, layered all the way out through those longer range integrated systems like the Patriot, and tying them together with other ones. So having multiple Patriot batteries and all the C2 architecture, and the sensors and the queuing needed to get those things ready, and everything in between. And ideally, like a really robust integrated air defense system, you have all of that, because you want to maximize your opportunity to get that missile before it gets to a target. You don't want just a 60-mile bubble, and then if you fail there, well, crap, it's going through, it's going to hit. You want to have lots of layers in between, and down to the person with their weapon trying to knock it out of the sky before it hits the target.
So in that regard, as we, just sort of thinking about what are the implications of this, we go from, a guy with a rifle out of his window to a guy with a Stinger missile to the integrated air defense, like all the way from point to area, so that basically the people operating this provide wider defense, more information, more and earlier opportunities to intercept these missiles coming in, thereby creating a greater air defense bubble around a general area. How is this basically, like, when we think about the implications of this? Russia's going to fire the missiles at civilian infrastructure basically no matter what. They'll only stop if they don't think it's going to make really any use. And to the point that we've seen how Russia treats its equipment, how Russia treats its people, if they fire 70 and 10 are getting through, that's good enough. Probably only to the point where 0 are getting through that they're going to change their deliberations or their calculations on what's going to, on whether to fire or not. So ostensibly, the Patriot missile system, as well as everything else that Ukraine already has, will get that number probably not to 0 consistently, but as close to 0 on a consistent basis as possible. How does that then change the way that Ukraine conducts its war fighting against the Russian forces still in Ukraine?
So I'm not going to claim like my unique insight on this because I've been reading online about some of the implications. But among the things that this, if they get enough Patriot systems that they can put up a fairly robust bubble around those civilian targets. One, that's just better to protect those targets, right? But another thing it does is the systems that are currently there, like I mentioned, the S-300 and some of the other air defense systems that are being used, it frees those up to push those forward to more tactical employment closer to the front line, maybe against, maybe it's an early interception opportunity against those missiles. But it also puts more air defense systems up against Russian aviation. And, if Russia is sort of trying to posture itself for a renewed attempt at an offensive somewhere around there, if they run into, a bunch of newly, re-emplaced systems that have been freed up from Ukrainian cities, that's going to make a worse day for their Air Force than they've already had. And they already, something we've seen in this conflict is, neither side really being able to gain control of the air in any sort of meaningful fashion. Well, if you push a whole bunch of air defense systems closer up to the front line, that's just going to make it that much harder for Russia to use a combined arms approach to include ground maneuver, ground fires, but also aviation fires, aerial surveillance, and things like that to get that offensive to work. So that's one possible implication of this. As the Patriot systems come online.
Great. And so I think this is part of where we can understand what is the Russian way of war and what these air defense systems will make a difference, is that we've seen that the Russians throughout this conflict, the thing that they prioritize is effectively the ground-based fires. And the maneuvers on the ground of the infantry and so forth are done. And this is what we heard about yesterday from General Fulford, the Deputy Director of European Command, is that the air attacks plus the ground attacks, both of those support the ground-based artillery, which is what the Russians really use in order to reduce everything in front of them to rubble to the greatest extent. And so preventing this from the air is also what then will inhibit the Russians from putting their ground forces forward, which then inhibits their use of ground-based fires, the different artillery systems that they have, and so forth. So this is really trying to interdict how the Russians actually fight their conflicts, the conflict that we've seen over the past 9 months.
Yeah, well, I note that the increasing the density of air defense systems closer to the front, it's not to say the Russians, still won't just try and saturate an area with fires. But I think maybe in this might tie into something we'll get into here a little bit later is as you run out of weapons to fire, even if you run out of, unguided artillery shells to fire, for them to be effective, you need, proper observation for where those fires are. And so if you're at the point where like just saturating, putting a grid square full of high explosive artillery, if you don't have the shells to do that anymore, you need to get those shells like on target or close enough to a target to be militarily meaningful for you to help your ground scheme and maneuver. And what the air defense potentially does is it reduces the Russians' ability to use aerial observation for those fires. And it's, something we've seen on both sides, in fact, has been the use of unmanned aircraft systems, right? Drones as artillery spotters. And, and that's partly because using a manned aircraft is pretty dangerous when you're close to the front because of that density of air defense systems. You put more up there, it could allow the Ukrainian forces to be a little bit more liberal in using munitions against those drones as artillery spotters. And so as you reduce the ability of your artillery to have precise effects on the target you want it to affect, and your artillery has less ammunition to fire, that's putting into that horns of a dilemma that we talk about on the the Marine Corps side and the U.S. side of What do you do then? Like you have limited shells, you want to shoot them at something, but you don't know where that thing is to shoot it at. So do you not shoot it at all, or do you just kind of stick your finger in the air, do again some of that Kentucky windage, and just put shells down range because that's what Colonel General so and so he wants to hear artillery firing, doesn't care what it's fired at, and now you're using precious munitions against just open ground, right? Not a military meaningful target. That's going to make it harder for those ground forces when they go thinking that a target might have been suppressed or destroyed by artillery when it's really not. And this gets into the economic impacts of shrinking Russian economy and their ability to produce these things in volume, to have them be effective on the battlefield, really in the sort of near to intermediate term, which is when their mobilized forces are going to start coming to bear, when it's going to have to matter.
So I think so. There's a lot in there, but in effect, to think about how to put this all together is the integrated air defense system, wider area, more information, places difficulties on the Russians because they won't be able to land their missiles as often and as effectively. And so therefore, as you put it, when then directing their fires from whichever sort of origin, it's just going to be less effective. But we also see, and this is sort of what we're thinking about, how does like the winter and spring fighting go? And then we can think about basically the clocks that we've talked about. What's going to run out first? Western support for Ukraine or the Russian economy? What the what the integrated air defense systems do, and Patriot as an example thereof, is basically force Russians to make more difficult decisions. And we've seen over the course of the conflict, as you put it, Colonel General just wants artillery being fired because then if the missiles are no longer there, then he can probably invent all the casualty figures and destruction figures, to then put up the chain for someone else to say that no, that did or did not happen. But I think maybe our next episode we'll talk about the Russian ways of deception, and how Russia is not a learning organization. But in terms of what we observe right now, in terms of the winter fighting, we can observe at least three different things happening at once in terms of what we can expect over the next couple weeks and months as the weather gets colder and the intensity of operations will increase. First, the town of Bakhmut, which probably will not exist in any meaningful sense, like several other Ukrainian towns when this is all over, is the town of Bakhmut has been a real Russian objective over the last number of months. We also have, coordinated messaging campaign from the Ukrainian side, from General Zaluzhny, their chief of staff on down, that they anticipate a counteroffensive basically is coming, that there's no point to mobilize 2 to 500,000, Russian individuals, except to put them through the meat grinder. And that we've also observed Ukrainian missile attacks on Melitopol, which, given its location on the Sea of Azov coast, is basically the intent of which is, if the Ukrainians are able to make their way to Melitopol, they will then cut the land bridge from Donbass to Crimea in half. And that would again be a turning point in the conflict. So in terms of what is the point of Bakhmut, strategically, it doesn't have much value. So in terms of why do the Russians keep wanting to get this, this gets into the idea of who's going to win and how long will it take that side to get there. What is clear from the Ukrainian perspective is that they want to basically get as much support as possible because they've demonstrated on the battlefield they are the superior side. One of the jokes that we often hear is that before this war, people around the world thought that Russia had the second most powerful military in the world, but as it turns out, they have the second most powerful military in Ukraine. It's a mild laugh line at best, but ultimately what it goes down into is that Ukrainians have done more with less, and the Russians have done less with more. And so the greater that the Ukrainians can get that correlation of forces in balance, their more efficient use of the material and the people that they have has essentially demonstrated their ability to take back land. If Bakhmut is taken, from all of the understanding, there's not much military value in it, but it would be devastating from the informational perspective, because what it would provide the Russian side the ability to do is to say the Ukrainian version of what's going on is not false, that they will not be able to retake their territory by force, and that Russia is able, now that it's getting um, more people to the fight, that it's basically turning its entire industrial economy to military production, that it's going to be able to retake, quote unquote, its own territory back, or to basically take the fight to different areas of Ukraine. And so that therefore, the thing that the Russians are going for by trying to take Bakhmut is not basically the military issue here, but the Western support for Ukraine. And that if they can weaken that and weaken the flow of things such as Patriot air defense systems, that they will basically be able to bring the Ukrainians to the negotiating table sooner than the Ukrainians want, and sooner than the Ukrainians are able to retake their territory by force. Putin has been very clear on every single occasion that's been given to him that he views Ukraine as basically a rebellious province that should not be able to exercise the autonomy that it has, and to have its sovereignty negotiated at the level of great powers, i.e., between Russia and the United States. And being able to basically make that come into reality, even though, all American policymakers always say nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, is that they want to get to the point where Ukraine is facing dwindling support. So by the time that Russia is able to muster whatever counteroffensive it's going to do, the Ukraine is just in a weaker position, and that once they see, again, two, three, four, 500,000, basically Russian troops going into the meat grinder, that they'll be overwhelmed by that mass. And that's the position that the Russians want to put them in, and that's what Bakhmut is effectively the gateway towards. The counteroffensive is coming because clearly over the course of this conflict, Putin has demonstrated that he has no regard for life, not merely the lives of people on the adversary side, but no regard for the lives of people on his side. We've seen a number of reports, eyewitness reports by, the participants themselves, where we've had Russian mobilized soldiers um, basically being sent into open air, into open ground, in order to draw Ukrainian artillery fire, so that they basically act as human forward observers, so that the Russian artillery can then go after Ukrainian artillery. If we're talking about basically these effectively like pre-modern tactics, 200,000. So if, let's say, there's already 100,000 Russian dead or wounded, unable to fight, what's another 200,000? If the very end of it is that Putin gets a land bridge acknowledged by the international community, or that he's able to defend this land basically into the future after he's gone from, this earth, much less office, then what's 100, 200, 300, 400, 500,000 dead people? It's all basically stuff that will get washed away in the sands of time. And so that, in essence, is what we're going to see over the course of this winter fighting. The Russians not caring about human life, trying to take Bakhmut, and to try to defend, to the extent possible, these towns such as Melitopol, Zaporizhia, so that they can contain the basically the territory that they've already conquered, and which is the key objective of Putin in this conflict.
So, a quick question for you in that: is there any sense of either intent or capability for Russia to potentially launch another like renewed offensive operation somewhere besides Bakhmut? Are there indications they might be preparing for that somewhere else, or do they even have the extra, you know, bodies and equipment to do that, even if they wanted to?
What we're seeing is that Russia's clearly preparing for a spring to summer counteroffensive. That's a guarantee. Whilst you take, 500,000 people from the workforce, exacerbating inflation and, like workforce issues in Russia itself, they're training as many people as possible inside Russia, but also in Belarus. Putin canceled his annual press conference, which has a circus slash really awkward keg party like energy to what should be basically the one time of the year in which journalists from foreign outlets, as well as basically provincial outlets, get to ask the good Tsar like the questions about what's going on. And for those who have seen it, it really is like a bizarre experience because it'll be like a reporter from basically the Russian equivalent of like Peoria saying like, I have a specific question about a specific factory which is not paying its salaries. And Putin will sit there and be like, my God, elevator factory number 8 in Podunskville is not paying its workers. Give me the phone. Let me call the person in charge. And it goes through this theater, good Tsar, bad boyars. It goes through this theater that has basically been unchanged since maybe like the time of Ivan the Terrible. But if Putin's not doing this press conference, he is going to Minsk and on Monday. And in Minsk, he's going to be giving the business to his Belarusian subordinate, president slash junior assistant, in terms of Lukashenko has stayed out of the fighting for basically the past 10 months. He's going to put whatever screws are available on him, on Lukashenko, to not just host Russian troops training on Belarus, but for Belarus to allow its soldiers to be used in whatever forthcoming conflict. And this is what the Ukrainian General Staff has been warning, is that Russia basically has one big offensive left in it before its economy collapses. So another attack on Kyiv, another attack on Kharkiv, another attack from basically every direction possible in order to try to overwhelm whatever existing Ukrainian forces are there to defend. And the reason for that is when you put all these things together, is the Patriot a game changer? Probably not. There's no one thing that is a game changer in the course of a war. We also said this about Stingers. We also said this about HIMARS. We also said this about everything. But if we think from the beginning of this conflict, from a Stinger all the way to a Patriot missile, and all the other things that we've talked about over the course of like the past 10 months, the direction is clear in terms of Ukraine getting better and better over time in its ability to, one, defend itself, and two, retake its territory. Russia is not getting any more sophisticated in its equipment. It's not getting better in terms of its personnel. If we're seeing basically like mobilization of like regular guys like me plus prisoners, it means that in essence, Putin is not really going for the cream of the crop in terms of physical capacity, as well as basically just human capital. If you're sending prisoners there, you're sending people who are open to making bad decisions. So that, in essence, is the clock on the Russian side. They're not going to be in good position in December 2023. So to avoid being in the position where they still need to make gains in 2023, they're throwing everything they have over basically the next 6 months. That's why Putin is going to Belarus. That's why they're basically preparing for the counteroffensive, is because they're not winning any war in a year from now. So they need to win as much as possible between now and basically the end of the first half of the next year, because it's all downhill from there. And this is where we can start to think, we've talked a lot about Western support for Ukraine, Ukrainian resilience. Those things so far are basically true, robust. And again, the Patriots are a demonstration that what the West is trying to do is for Ukraine to not lose, so that it has the ability to have a chance of winning. What's going on the Russian side? What does the Russian clock look like? There's a lot of stuff that's not good. But again, one thing to preface all of the discussion about all the bad news that's coming out of Russia is that Putin doesn't care about human life, which is very useful, honestly. If you're fighting a casualty intensive way of war, that is no inconsequential matter. The second is that Russia still has hundreds of billions of dollars in its reserves that it is trying to avoid burning through. So Putin is willing to basically take on a lot more pain from the economy and from the domestic population because there's money in the reserves and he's not facing, let's say, any meaningful elections anytime soon. Plenty of riot police in Russia in the meantime. So, what is happening right now? One, let's say the first big thing to think about is like, why are we also seeing a lot of this activity now? In the first quarter of 2023, we're going to get to the maximum extent possible the data on how Russia's economy fared in 2022. All of it is bad. And I'll go through a couple like the main points going forward. But what does bad economic news, even if basically the Russians completely dissemble, lie with statistics, all that sort of stuff, what it means in basically like at the top line is once you acknowledge bad news is there, and people inside and outside Russia know that this is basically the best available version of the news, but that the reality is somehow worse. It makes people then think, okay, if they said the economy is only declining by 2.5% over 2022, which is what Putin said the economic data is going to be, the IMF has said it's negative 4.5%. Others have said it's going to be up to 7%. If people then think the real range is from negative 2.5 to negative 7, the Russian Ministry of Finance has already put in a base from the previous pre-war budget, a blanket 10% cut in every budget across the land. That was before the bad news was acknowledged. If people then think to themselves, it's no better than negative 2.5, it could be up to 7, but they've already cut the budget by 10%. What does cutting the budget further look like? And once people get that, basically that bad idea, that seed of doubt incepted in their minds, they then start to think, well, how much worse could this get? How much more bad news can my company or my ministry or my region handle? And that is essentially the danger to Putin. Not that people are going to protest on the streets, but that people at every level of government, the people who rely on the federal budget in order to survive, that they start to think not only is the gravy train basically reducing in the volume of gravy that it'll be delivering, but I may not get any gravy in the second half of this year. If I'm not getting any gravy at the second half of this year, what are the steps that I should take now in order to protect all the people that I need to account for? And then that's essentially the run on the bank. It's every minister, governor, business leader, and all the way down to like the lowest bureaucrat in the dustiest village thinking, what is the rational decision that I need to take to protect myself and my own, which is then replicated across the entire bureaucracy. And then you have individuals at every level of governance thinking for themselves instead of working within the power vertical. And once that happens, that's essentially when governments really come to an end, because at that point, you have completely uncoordinated behavior at different levels of government. The people who wanted to basically follow Putin no matter what can then observe, oh man, everyone else is looking out for themselves. I'd be a, I was about to swear, I'd be a sucker in order to not do that for myself, because why be the last person left on the sinking ship? That is at its core the thing that has brought down every Russian and Soviet government before. It's not losing the war, it's not having the economy tank on you, but it's having people believe we haven't yet reached the bottom. I don't know where the bottom is, but I observe people starting to take care of themselves first. That is, Putin will be done in weeks thereafter. That's the bank run. So, in essence, what are the points that we've observed, each one of which is not determinative, but each one of which gets us to think what's the next shoe to drop? We have seen in terms of just the corrosion of the existing Russian economy through the data that the Russian government itself provides, nothing good. We're starting to observe, so the latest top line inflation data, like here in the United States, it's running at 7%, 7.1% the latest data. The latest data in Russia, 12%. on their version of CPI on a monthly basis. We're also observing that because there are intense manpower issues within the workforce, because a lot of people have, one, left the country, two, are in training camps, three, just dead, a lot of dead people. Um, Russian wages are also experiencing some of the sharpest upticks in years because employers have to offer higher wages. We've seen in terms of the oil price cap, the oil price cap basically works by denying access to Western shipping and insurance services, which is basically all European in the world, to those shippers which are unable to attest that they paid more than $60 per barrel for the oil that they are using. What this has done is basically not done much to Russian exports of oil to the West, but what it has done is has allowed the Asian, primarily Chinese and Indian buyers to basically say, oh, I think we've identified what we're not going to pay more than. So it's provided forced discounts and increased leverage by non-Western purchasers of Russian oil, which again will limit the revenues that Russia has coming in. We're also seeing a drone export ban was just passed by the Europeans. But in terms of what the oil price that has come in, is that since the Europeans announced the oil price ban was coming in, there has been a $20 drop in the barrel price of oil, and a $25 difference has opened up between the Brent price, which is the price that basically the West pays, and the Urals price, which is basically what the Asian states are paying, such primarily China and India. So GDP is down, source of future revenues are down, inflation and all the aspects inside the economy are down, are up rather. Imports continue to be very difficult. And so we start to see none of these things are determinative, but they all lead into a much larger story of basically who knows what's next. And this is where we get into stories that we haven't seen since the 1990s. And these include mass arson across Moscow, because it's more money to burn something down, particularly if you think someone is going to steal it from you. You might as well just burn your building down. Also, if you are contracted to provide something to the government and you're unable to do so, you can face a lot of trouble unless your factory has burned down. We're starting to see at least these perhaps now not so isolated news stories of business disputes being settled by guns, both in Moscow and across the provinces. Huge uptick in cases of individuals suing each other through basically Russia's business court, the Court of Arbitrations. And the reason that this is important is because obviously, like, business entities, they owe each other stuff. They sign contracts like, I'm going to make a widget and I will then sell that widget to you so that you can create basically some other item which could have military use. If I, as the widget producer, am unable to import something, well, then you're going to sue me because I failed to deliver. But what we're seeing is that a lot of businesses are trying to ask for essentially force majeure declarations from Russia's business court. Russian business court have so far denied that, to a huge increase in those numbers, because a force majeure means that essentially the company B basically doesn't have anymore the legal expectation that they're going to get something from company A. And if that's the case, then basically the contract system of Russia falls down. And the reason that basically the Court of Arbitration within Russia doesn't want to go to this step is, if they acknowledge that a force majeure exists, that means that there is an emergency that was unforeseen. An emergency that was unforeseen means that there is a war, and that because there is no war, it's just a special military operation. It means that the Court of Arbitration in Russia is essentially trying to prevent the breakdown of the economy and contractual obligations by their own determination, because that's something that belongs obviously to President Putin. So each one of these, oil price cap, Court of Arbitration trying to basically keep the plate spinning in the air, various import-export bans coming in, oil money not being as much as before. None of those things are determinative, but they all create a story that is going to be harder and harder for Putin to essentially defend his government against over the course of 2023. And that's why he wants as much violence and as much success now to avoid being in that position in 6 months and beyond. And that's essentially the clock on the Russian side.
Yeah, interesting as you describe that. I'd note that sort of this very concern was a question that was brought up yesterday again to that lecture with the ambassador and the general by one of the gunnery sergeants from the enlisted schools. Basically what would that tipping point look like? And reminds me of it's a quote that I think has been applied to the fall of the Soviet Union and other things that were sort of not foreseen. Is things happen gradually and then suddenly. And as you've described it, there's a lot of gradual friction points, plates being held up in the air. That if one starts we don't know when one starts going to crashing down, but as one starts, it could take a lot with them, and we could see a rapid acceleration of chaos inside Russia, which again, not a scenario anyone's really looking forward to. My thought is like even if Putin is able to put together enough force for a counteroffensive, I would put the odds of any meaningful success fairly low. For a number of reasons, but partly because as we sort of learning the lessons from the initial buildup, like any offensive that he's trying to build up will be fairly noted where it's going to happen, because you're going to have to pre-stage a lot of stuff and a lot of people there, which in turn is going to give Ukraine, as if necessary, time to shift defenses up to wherever that's going to happen. And then when that happens, what are the odds that that offensive is going to be successful? And then if that offensive is not successful and it coincides with all of these plates crashing into each other, winter of 2023 doesn't look that great, at least if you're Putin or Russian.
So when we then think about we're approaching, within 2 months here, like the 1 year anniversary of the conflict, and it's clear the conflict is still going to be on by then. When we started this, like I was reviewing notes from February, March of earlier this year, and we were actually like reading again the newsletters that I've been doing since the beginning of the conflict, looking at the notes that we had for like the initial episodes of this. You and I were able to foresee or forecast much of what we've seen. So kudos to us. But ultimately at that point, the big sort of like prediction that we had is the Ukrainians are going to do better than we expect, but the Russians just have a really big head start. And essentially the Russian success is just going to come not from being better at fighting, but just have more fighting available to them. 9-10 months on, I think that's more or less held up. That's the thing. What we're talking about right now is the Ukrainians catching up, and the ability of Russia to continue fighting at the scale that it's doing is slowing down. Eventually, those two, basically like that correlation of forces, will meet. That, in essence, is the point of which, when we're talking about what is Putin trying to avoid, he's trying to avoid that reasonable level of parity in which his theory of war, his theory of victory, I should say, and his theory of conflict termination, we will basically overwhelm the Ukrainians to the point that the territory that we have at that point will become once and forever Russia. That will no longer hold. And once that no longer holds, that in essence is the beginning of the end internally. That is, in terms of prediction, we'll get there in 1 year from today. And so therefore, if the Ukrainians don't lose, basically over the course of the next 6 months, that's in essence the point in which the Ukrainians will be ready to go to the negotiating table, because they will have the sense that they're on the ascendancy. It'll be clear on the Russian side that no more good news is coming from the home front. And that's basically where they can basically terminate the conflict on at least terms that will allow Ukraine to defend itself into the future.
Yeah, although that also raises the question of Ukraine will be ready to terminate on its terms, but does that reality penetrate down through to Putin? And I thought again the ambassador yesterday brought up, I think he brought up sort of 4 possible outcomes sort of on the Russian side in terms of where this goes, if things go badly. And I think only one of those was, Putin basically accepts that he's lost and comes to some sort of negotiated settlement and walks away. The other ones were like somebody worse than him replaces him, right? Somebody better than him replaces him. And I don't think any of us
Chaos
have
is
any
number
sense
four.
like,
Chaos is number four.
yeah. And then chaos was number four. And I would submit that of those four options, right? Like somebody better than Putin, God only knows who that person is. I don't think there's certainly nobody who's standing up for the job, who's not wound up in jail or somewhere else. Certainly plenty of people worse than him because they're all, we're seeing them all on the Russian talk shows. And, for those in the audience who I wouldn't recommend sort of immersing yourself in these longer than you absolutely have to get a sense of what's going on. But there is like, if you think the way that Putin sort of talks and expresses himself, or how some of the official Russian, ministry members and spokespeople represent themselves, is bad, there is a real darkness, a real sort of primal darkness in the way the Russian official talk show people talk about the war, talk about the West, talk about the Ukrainians, which if it almost seems like a parody, but when you watched enough of them, like the tone of the shows doesn't change, and there's a real darkness there. So the idea that somebody worse than him could come along, there were plenty of people to choose from, at least in that realm, and then complete internal chaos inside of a nuclear armed state is also not a great thing. So of those four options the ambassador threw up there, not a lot of ones that are both plausible and positive, I guess, for us to look at.
The way to think about it is just imagine, Putin's without any legitimacy going back to like the early 2000s or governing talent. I think maybe the next episode we can talk about the nature of deception in Russia, vranyo, and talk about maybe what are the paths forward for Putin over the course of 2023.
Yeah, we can certainly explore that. And I also know we owe our audience a larger separate episode about various nations' nuclear ambitions, and we still need to do that one about Iranian weapons, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So yeah, I think we've gone pretty well over the time that we were looking to do, but we have been out of this for a little bit while, so we did owe a pretty good catch up to our audience. So I guess we'll stop it there. Yuval, as always, thank you very much for your time. To our audience, thank you for getting an update here on Down the Rabbit Hole in the Russia-Ukraine war. And we will certainly try and get you another episode quicker than 4 weeks it took us to do this one. So until then, take care, and we'll see you all later.
Happy trails.